The first time Eleanor saw him, she was brushing her teeth. It was a Tuesday morning in October, the kind of ordinary moment that shatters lives when no one is paying attention. She stood in her bathroom, pale fixtures, too bright fluorescent light, and caught movement in the mirror's corner. Not her reflection. Something behind her reflection, as though the glass held depth it shouldn't possess. A man's face, aristocratic and devastated, watched her with eyes the color of old wine. Eleanor spun around. The bathroom was empty. When she turned back to the mirror, he was gone. But the temperature had dropped enough that her breath misted against the glass. She touched it. Frost gathered beneath her fingertips despite the October warmth bleeding through the window. She told no one. By week's end, he appeared in her dreams, always the same dream, though the details shifted like watercolor in rain. They stood in a library vast enough to be a cathedral, candlelight throwing his shadow across leather spines that whispered when touched. He wore a nobleman's coat from another century, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of languages dead for 200 years. "You shouldn't have come here," he would say, reaching toward her through the darkness. "It isn't safe. You aren't safe with me." But Eleanor found herself moving closer, drawn by something deeper than fear, a recognition that lived in her blood before her mind could name it. When his fingers nearly brushed her cheek, she would wake gasping, her skin burning where he'd almost touched her. The dreams intensified. Every night became an architecture of longing libraries, gardens where moonlight pooled like silver water, chambers carved from living stone where candles burned in perpetual darkness. And always him, always watching her with an expression that married hunger to despair. He never fed on her in these dreams. He never even crossed the space between them fully. But the wanting was there, thick and terrible and beautiful. Eleanor began to change. She stopped going to the gym, stopped answering texts from her colleagues at the university where she taught medieval literature. Her apartment, a sensible 2-bedroom, in a sensible building in sensible Portland, began to feel like a cage made of sunlight. She found herself drawn to dim corners, to candlelight, to recordings of opera and chamber music from centuries she'd never lived through. And the mirrors, every reflective surface, had become a window. She would catch him in car windows as she drove, in shop glass as she walked, in still water. Always the same face, always watching. The first time she saw him in broad daylight, sprawled across her bedroom mirror, while rain hammered the windows outside, she didn't look away. "What do you want from me?" she whispered. For the first time, he moved beyond the glass. Not through it, but his hand pressed against the other side of the surface, and she placed hers against it. Even separated by that mysterious barrier, she felt cold radiating from him, and something else, hunger, ancient and aching. "To know you," he said, and his voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "To understand why you exist, why you, specifically, across all the years I've walked this God-forsaken earth." Eleanor's hand trembled. "I don't understand what you are. I am a ruin," he said. "A monument to every faith I abandoned, every mercy I squandered. I am a vampire, Eleanor, and I have been haunting you for 93 days, watching through every surface that holds a reflection. Because something in your blood sings to something in mine that I thought had died centuries ago." The word vampire should have triggered fear. Rational, sensible Eleanor, the one who graded papers and attended faculty meetings, should have backed away. Instead, she felt something in her chest unlock, some tightly sealed chamber opening to release a flood of memory that wasn't hers. Stone cathedrals, candlelit confession booths, a voice made of church bells saying, "The blood price has been paid." Hands stained with something that wasn't wine, pressed against her own hands. "I am so sorry. I am so eternally sorry. I know you," Eleanor breathed, understanding blooming like flowers through broken concrete. "I remember you." "No," he said, and the anguish in his voice cracked something in her ribs. "You couldn't possibly. Not yet, but you will. That's what frightens me. That's what I've spent 3 months trying to prevent by watching you from mirrors and shadows, keeping distance between us like a saint keeps from temptation." "Then why appear to me at all?" "Because tonight," he said, "someone else found you. Someone who knows what you are, what sleeps in your bloodline, and I cannot let them have you. I will not. Even if it damns me further." Eleanor moved to her window. Outside, the Portland night had gone unnaturally dark, despite the streetlights. A figure stood beneath the oak tree across the street, still as bone, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. "Who is that?" she asked. "A hunter," the voice from the mirror said. "The first of many, I suspect. Because you, Eleanor Ashford, carry the blood of my covenant in your veins. And that makes you either my salvation or my annihilation." He had never spoken her full name before. Hearing it in that voice layered with centuries and sorrow, and a devotion that felt older than the world, broke something in Eleanor that had been broken long before she ever saw his face in her mirror. "What happens now?" she whispered. "Now," he said. "I have to either save you or damn you both." The figure beneath the oak tree moved. Eleanor watched its neck bend at an angle no living thing could achieve, watched it begin to climb the building's facade with inhuman fluidity. The mirror shattered, not from impact from the inside. The glass fractured into 1,000 gleaming shards, and for one crystalline moment, she saw him fully corpse-pale, beautiful, wearing the face of a suffering saint before the shards collapsed. Then Eleanor heard her apartment door break, felt the temperature drop like the world had been plunged into winter, and in the darkness of her bedroom, she heard two voices converge, one she knew from 93 Nights of Dreams, one that sounded like stone scraping bone, and she understood. Everything she was, everything she would become, existed in the space between them. The true haunting was beginning. Eleanor's scream caught in her throat, transformed into something else, not quite language, not quite animal. The hunter moved through her bedroom with predatory grace, its movements too fluid, too many angles. In the darkness, she could make out only impressions. Elongated fingers, teeth that caught what little light filtered through the window, and eyes, those terrible hunting eyes. Then he was there. The man from the mirrors stepped between Eleanor and the hunter in motion so swift the human eye couldn't track it, even in shadow, even fractured by darkness. He was beautiful, but in the way a cathedral is beautiful when it's burning. His coat, the same aristocratic garment from her dreams, somehow real, swept around him like wings as he moved, and when he spoke, his voice resonated through the floorboards, through Eleanor's bones, through her very blood. "Matthias," he said, and the single word carried centuries of bitter history. "You've grown bold. Or stupid. Both. Perhaps." The hunter laughed a sound like breaking glass. "Cassius, the fallen knight plays nursemaid to the mortal girl. How deliciously pathetic. Does she know what she is? Does she understand the blood that runs through her veins? That we could smell it from Moscow?" Eleanor found her voice, thin and shaking. "What am I?" Cassius didn't turn, but she saw his shoulders tense. "Not now, Eleanor. Run. The cellar. Go down." "She won't run," Matthias interrupted, stepping sideways, circling. "She'll stand here and watch us dance, and she'll finally understand why you've been so tender with her. You're not protecting her, Cassius. You're collecting her, saving a piece of the woman you almost made 300 years ago." The accusation landed like a blade. Cassius's form seemed to ripple, as though something massive was pressing outward from beneath his skin. "She is nothing like Catherine." "No," Matthias agreed, his lips drawing back from fangs that descended like ivory daggers. "She's better. Can't you smell it? That particular blood note, it's the covenant strain, the chosen bloodline. She's not just of our kind, Cassius. She's written in our bones. She's one of the 7 that was supposed to come in the Age of Reckoning." Cassius moved. Eleanor had no reference point for the violence that erupted. In the movies, vampire fights were choreographed chaos, bodies slamming through walls, dramatic blood spray. This was worse because it was faster, more economical. Cassius and Matthias became blurs of motion and shadow, their forms fragmenting against the dark. She heard bone crack, heard something wet hit her bedroom wall, heard Cassius scream not from pain, but from effort, from something that sounded like rage wrapped in 7 centuries of denial. Then silence. Matthias lay against her bookshelf, his chest caved inward at an angle that suggested his sternum had been crushed. His eyes still glowed, still hungry, even as he began to laugh, a wet, bubbling sound. "She'll choose him," Matthias gasped. "They always do. The fallen ones, they're so good at redemption. She'll love him, and he'll damn her. And then, another cough of something dark. And then, the covenant will awaken, and all of us will burn." Cassius pressed his foot down, finishing what he'd started. The sound Eleanor would have preferred not to hear, the sound of a body ceasing to exist, concluded itself, and her bedroom went still again. For a long moment, only Cassius remained, standing among the fragments of her life. Broken glass from the mirror, pages from her scattered books, blood that glowed faintly in the darkness, some of it wet and dark. Matthias, some of it already fading to nothing, feeding light, she realized, the way certain candles consume air itself. Cassius turned to her. In the darkness, she could see his face more clearly than the mirror ever allowed. He was young, perhaps 30, and devastated. His lip was split, and his eyes still held the feral brightness of fresh feeding. But beneath it all, she saw what 3 months of mirror haunting had been building toward. A man looking at something that mattered more than his own damnation. "Don't scream," he said quietly. Eleanor realized she was already screaming a high, thin sound she couldn't quite stop. She clamped her hand over her mouth. "I am Cassius de Vere," he continued, as though making formal introductions in her gore-painted bedroom was somehow reasonable. "I was a cardinal of the Church of Rome in 1723. I broke my vows for a woman named Catherine, traded my faith for forbidden knowledge, and when that knowledge turned out to be necromancy, the price was paid in blood and transformation. I have spent 300 years trying to atone for sins that cannot be forgiven." He reached into his pocket and withdrew something that caught the moonlight, a portrait. Miniature, painted in oils. Even from across the room, Eleanor could see the face. A woman with her cheekbones, her eyes, her dark hair. "Catherine," Cassius said softly, "my eternal punishment and my only prayer. She died in my arms, and I was too new to the curse to save her. The vampire venom wasn't yet in my system, and she burned instead of transforming. I watched it happen. Every second. His voice broke. Eleanor found herself moving toward him, which contradicted every survival instinct screaming through her nervous system, but the pull was stronger, that blood-deep recognition, that sense of knowing him across centuries. "The covenant," she said. It wasn't a question. Something in her bones understood it. "That's what he said. The 7 bloodlines. I'm part of something, aren't I? Something old." Cassius looked at the portrait, then at her, and something shifted in his expression, a terrible kind of wonder. "Your mother," he said slowly. "Your mother was Catherine's daughter. The child Catherine was carrying when I turned her. I didn't know she was too far gone, too far burning. I thought the child died with her. My mother said I was adopted," Eleanor whispered. "Not adopted, saved. The covenant priestesses took you from the flames before they could consume Catherine entirely, and they hid you in the mortal world, waiting." Cassius stepped closer. "The curse that made me was never supposed to create just monsters, Eleanor. It was supposed to create bridges between the blood and the holy, between damnation and grace. There were supposed to be 7 of you, born of vampire and human love, bred to be something neither race could achieve alone. And Matthias feared you," Cassius said. "All of them do. Because the covenant bloodline doesn't answer to the old laws. It doesn't answer to anyone but itself." Eleanor looked at her hands, half expecting them to be different, transformed. They looked the same, her hands, ordinary and alive, except now she could feel it, humming beneath her skin like a second heartbeat. Not hunger, not exactly. Something older, something that recognized Cassius the way a compass recognizes north. "I can feel it," she breathed. "I can feel you. In my blood. How is that possible?" Cassius closed his eyes. "Because Catherine's blood carries the mark of my turning. Because you inherited not just her blood, but the imprint of mine, the covenant bonding. And because I have stood at your threshold every night for 3 months, pressing my will into your dreams, trying to prepare you for this moment without driving you mad." He opened his eyes, and they were filled with such ancient sorrow that Eleanor's breath caught. "I came to save you from the hunters," he said. "But I'm terrified, Eleanor Ashford, because what I really want is to keep you, to claim you, to make you what I am, so that you'll never leave me, the way Catherine did." He reached out his hand. "And I don't know if that's love or damnation. I don't know if I'm your salvation or your curse." Eleanor took his hand. The moment their skin met, the world shifted. She saw through Catherine's eyes as Cassius's fangs descended, felt the ecstasy and agony of the transformation, experienced the burning that consumed her from the inside out. She felt the child being pulled from Catherine's dying womb, felt the hands of priestesses wrapping her in cloth blessed and blood-stained. She felt 300 years compressed into a single breath, 3 centuries of Cassius waiting, watching, preparing the world for her coming. And beneath it all, she felt love, not the romantic kind from her books and movies, but something far more dangerous. The kind of love that rewrites kingdoms. The kind that falls from grace and never wants to rise again. "I remember," Eleanor whispered. "All of it. I remember being born in fire." Cassius pulled her close, and in his arms, Eleanor finally understood what it meant to be chosen not by God or destiny, but by a damned man who had waited longer than most nations existed for a second chance at salvation. The apartment door was open. The city beyond spread out beneath her window. full of sleeping people who had no idea that their world had just shifted. Outside, in the darkness, other hunters were converging. Cassius moved through her apartment like a man accustomed to leaving no trace. He gathered what Eleanor might need: clothes, documents, a leather journal that she realized must have belonged to her mother. His movements were economical, practiced, the movements of someone who had fled before. "Where are we going?" Eleanor asked, though part of her already knew. The dreams had prepared her for this: the vast library, the candlelight, the stone walls that predated nations. "Sanctuary," he said, fastening her coat around her shoulders. His fingers lingered at her collarbone, and she felt the weight of 300 years in that touch. "The Covenant keeps archives in places the world has forgotten. There's a state in the Scottish Highlands, Ravencairn. It was a monastery before it was a hunting lodge, before it became what it is now. The priestesses maintain it, and they've been expecting you." "How could they be expecting me? You didn't even know I existed until 3 months ago." Cassius met her eyes, and there was something almost guilty in his expression. "I've known where you were for the entire 28 years of your life. The priestesses sent me word when you were born. I watched you grow up, Eleanor. I stood in the rain outside your schools, sat in the back of auditoriums during your university lectures. I was the stranger you felt watching you, the presence just outside your peripheral vision. The Covenant bond allows for a certain proximity across distance." Eleanor should have been horrified. Instead, she felt tears prickling her eyes because she had always known she was being watched. She had always felt him, hovering just beyond the veil of ordinary perception. "That's not creepy at all," she said, her voice wavering between hysteria and something that might have been gratitude. "I am a 300-year-old damned creature," Cassius said flatly. "Creepy is inevitable." They moved through Portland's sleeping streets in a car that manifested itself a vintage Mercedes that smelled of leather and old money. Cassius drove with preternatural calm, and Eleanor watched the city dissolve into suburbs, then into the Columbia River Gorge, then into darkness so complete that the headlights seemed to be carving truth out of nothing. "Tell me about Catherine," Eleanor said around 2 in the morning, as they crossed into Washington. Not as a punishment, as a story. Cassius was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she was the daughter of a cardinal. She used to sneak into the cathedral at night to read in the library the same way you sneak into yours. That's how I noticed her, actually. The way she moved through books like she was searching for something written in their margins. He turned the wheel, navigating a curve with one hand. "I was supposed to be holy. I had taken vows at 22, and for a decade, I meant them. But Catherine had this way of asking questions about faith that made every certainty crumble. She asked me why God would create beings with eternal souls but finite bodies. Why the divine spark was trapped in flesh that rotted. Whether there was sin in wanting to touch infinity." Eleanor could picture it: a young woman with her face, standing in candlelit stone chambers, asking dangerous questions. "What did you tell her?" "That I didn't know," Cassius said softly. "And then I kissed her, which answered nothing, but felt like the first true thing I'd ever done. We met for 3 years in the cathedral library. 3 years of stolen moments between prayer services. 3 years of me telling myself it wasn't real sin, because it was happening in a holy place." The road wound upward, and the darkness outside became alpine, vast and empty and primordial. "The necromancer found us," Cassius continued. "A man called Mordecai, who wanted immortality and believed the Covenant bloodline held the secret. He was right, in a way. The Covenant wasn't supposed to be just vampires and hunters. It was supposed to be a triad: vampire nobility, human priestesses, and a third bloodline born of their union. A line that could survive anything, transform anything, bridge the sacred and profane." Eleanor's fingers dug into the armrest. "What happened to him? The necromancer?" "The priestesses dealt with him," Cassius said. And there was something final in his tone that suggested the priestesses were not merciful. "But not before he infected me with the vampire curse. Not before I was forced to choose between staying human and watching Catherine age, or becoming what I am and trying to save her." He turned the wheel again, and suddenly Ravencairn rose before them, a fortress carved from black stone. Towers piercing the Scottish sky like obsidian needles. Lights burned in narrow windows, and Eleanor could feel something thrumming beneath the earth, an ancient pulse that made her teeth ache. "I chose transformation," Cassius said, pulling through an archway of wrought iron. "And I arrived too late. The venom was still settling in my blood, still too new, too unstable. Catherine couldn't survive the turning. She burned from the inside out while I held her, And our child, your grandmother, was cut from her womb in the final moments. The priestesses smuggled her out of Rome, raised her in hiding, and waited for the prophecy to fulfill itself. They parked in a courtyard surrounded by more stone, more candlelight filtering through Gothic windows. "Now you're here," Cassius said, turning to face her. "And the hunters know it, which means the clock is running." Eleanor followed him through Ravencairn's entrance into a hallway of towering shelves. Not the modern library of her dreams, but something older, a cathedral of knowledge carved into the earth itself. Books lined the walls from floor to vaulted ceiling, and the air smelled of old leather, candle wax, and something else, something like iron, like prayer, like blood. At the center of the library stood an altar, the Covenant Chamber, Cassius said quietly, where 7 priestesses stand eternal vigil, waiting for the 7 bloodlines to return. Only 3 have manifested in the last 2 centuries. You are the 4th. Eleanor approached the altar slowly. On its surface lay a book bound in what looked like human skin, and inside, she knew, would be names. Catherine's name, her own name, written in her grandmother's hand before Eleanor was even born. Names stretching back through centuries. All the women who carried the covenant in their blood, all the men who had loved them and been damned by it. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," Cassius said. "You learn what you are, and I try very hard not to fall in love with you again." Eleanor turned to face him. "Again? You're Catherine's daughter," he said, stepping closer. "And Catherine's granddaughter. And Catherine's great-great-granddaughter. You carry her in your bones, Eleanor. Her blood is your blood. When I look at you, I see all the women I've loved and lost across 3 centuries, compressed into one impossible form." He reached out, and this time, Eleanor didn't pull away. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, and she felt it, that burning recognition, the blood-deep knowing that had been calling to her through mirrors and dreams. "But you're not her," he whispered. "You're someone new, someone yours, and that terrifies me more than anything the hunters could do." Eleanor stood on her toes and kissed him. It was like touching a live wire. The moment their lips met, the library erupted with candlelight, every flame in the chamber igniting simultaneously, golden light flooding the stone cathedral. She felt his restraint warring with hunger, felt the weight of 300 years trying to stay gentle, trying to stay human. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor understood. This was the real curse. Not the vampirism, or the hunters, or the prophecy. It was loving someone who had been dying for 3 centuries, and being the first thing in all that time that made him want to live again. The priestesses of Ravencairn were not what Eleanor expected. She had imagined elderly women in robes, mystical and serene. Instead, she found herself facing 5 women ranging from early 20s to late 60s, all of them possessing the same dark eyes, the same eyes she saw in her own mirror. The same bloodline, she realized. The covenant strain ran through their veins too, though they had chosen service over transformation, mortality over immortality. The eldest, a woman named Margot, stood before Eleanor with an expression of such profound recognition that it felt like being seen through all her layers at once. "Catherine's child," Margot said softly. "We thought we'd lost you when the burning began, but the priestesses in Rome saved you from the pyre. 300 years of waiting, and you've come home." They gathered in a chamber deeper than the library, a crypt carved from living stone, lit by braziers of cold blue flame. The walls were covered in symbols that Eleanor's eyes couldn't quite focus on, runes and sigils that predated human language. In the center of the chamber stood a basin filled with liquid so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Your blood," Margot explained, "carries a mark that no ordinary turning can create. The covenant blood remembers things, past lives, ancient debts, the prayers of the dead. To fully awaken your potential, you must undergo the covenant binding, a ritual of remembrance and consecration." Cassius stood at the chamber's edge, separated from Eleanor by deliberate distance. She could feel his agitation, a restlessness that vibrated through the stone itself. "She's not ready," he said flatly. "She's barely accepted what she is. The binding is dangerous for someone untrained." "The binding is necessary," Margot countered. "The hunters are closing in. We've detected at least 7 covens moving toward Scotland. If Eleanor is to survive what's coming, she needs access to her full heritage. The binding grants that." Eleanor looked between Cassius and Margot. "What does the binding do?" "Exactly. It opens the blood memory." "One of the younger priestesses," said a woman named Isolde with tattoos of runes running down her arms. You'll experience every moment your bloodline has endured, every turning, every death, every love. You'll understand the covenant not as a curse, but as a calling. And the cost? Eleanor asked. Because there was always a cost. Pain, Margot said simply. But pain you've already carried in your blood. We're just making it conscious. Cassius moved before anyone could respond. He was at Eleanor's side in a blur of motion, his hand closing around hers. I won't allow it. Find another way. There is no other way, Margot said calmly. And you know it, Cassius DeVere. You've walked this path before. The covenant cannot be denied, only navigated. Eleanor squeezed Cassius's hand. If this is what I need to survive, then I do it. She saw him flinch, a flash of something ancient and wounded crossing his face. Without another word, she stepped toward the basin. The liquid was warm. It smelled of rust and roses and something older, something like the earth after rain, after birth, after death. Eleanor knelt beside the basin, and Margot handed her a knife. The blade was silver and ancient, and when Eleanor drew it across her palm, the pain was sharp and immediate. Her blood fell into the dark liquid, and the world inverted. Eleanor stood in a medieval cathedral, candlelight casting shadows that moved like they were alive. A young woman, Catherine, knelt before an altar, and Eleanor understood with perfect clarity that she was experiencing this through Catherine's senses, Catherine's body. The stone was cold beneath her knees. A man approached Cassius, younger, still human, still holy in his own way. This is wrong, Catherine whispered, and Eleanor felt the prayer caught in her throat. This is everything, Cassius replied, and Eleanor felt his touch like electricity. The memory shifted. Catherine in a bedchamber, swollen with child. Cassius pacing like a caged animal, the curse already beginning to show in his eyes. The moment he made the choice not to become what he was, but to try to become what he needed to be to save her. The burning. Oh, the burning. Eleanor experienced Catherine's final moments with such clarity that she screamed, and her scream echoed across 300 years. But the memory didn't end there. Eleanor found herself in a shadowed room in Rome, watching as priestesses worked blood rituals around a newborn child herself. She realized with horror, they were binding the child to the covenant, marking her with powers that would remain dormant until the moment she was awakened. Eleanor felt the knife scores on her infant body, felt the prayers being carved into her blood in ancient languages. She will be the bridge, an old priestess chanted. Born of damnation, she will walk between the kingdoms. Born of fire, she will not burn. The visions accelerated. Eleanor's grandmother, living in secret, raising Eleanor's mother in hidden chambers. Her mother, choosing mortality, choosing a normal life, choosing to hide Eleanor's heritage, until the moment she died in childbirth complications, the doctors said. Though Eleanor now understood the truth, the covenant blood ran too deep for an ordinary body to handle ordinary transformation. Eleanor saw herself as a child, felt the pull of the covenant in her blood, the dreams that started before she had language to describe them. She saw Cassius's presence, a constant warmth at the edge of perception, a guardian angel made of centuries and sorrow. She saw the hunters finding traces of her, following her bloodline through genealogical records, slowly closing in across years and continents, and underneath it all, she felt the longing, the ache of a love so old it predated human civilization, encoded in blood and bone, passed down through generations like a disease that had learned to masquerade as destiny. Eleanor surfaced, gasping, and she was back in the crypt, her hand still bleeding into the dark basin. But she was changed. The binding had rewritten something in her cellular structure, not physically, but spiritually, metaphysically. She could feel the covenant now, humming through her veins like a second heartbeat. She could sense the priestess's presence, the weight of 300 years of prayer and vigil, and she could feel Cassius, his terror and his love and his absolute certainty that he was damning her. I remember, Eleanor whispered. Everything. She stood, and candlelight reflected in her eyes not as human light, but as something older, something that predated the distinction between holy and unholy. Cassius took a step toward her, then stopped, as though he was afraid the person standing before him was no longer Eleanor but something the binding had created. The hunters won't wait, Margot said. The covenant awakening is like a beacon. They can feel it. We have perhaps 3 days before they breach Ravencairn's outer wards. Then we leave, Eleanor heard herself say. We take the fight to them. Cassius's head snapped toward her. Absolutely not. You need time to— I don't have time, Eleanor interrupted, and she was shocked by the authority in her voice, the certainty that came from 3 centuries of inherited knowledge. They've been hunting me since I was born. If I hide, I'm just postponing the inevitable. But if I meet them as what I am as the Covenant bloodline, then maybe, finally, the cycle ends. She turned to face Cassius fully, and she watched him process what he was seeing. Not Catherine, not a ghost of his past, but something new, something born from their love but entirely her own. I remember Catherine, Eleanor said quietly. I understand what she meant to you, but I'm not her, Cassius. I'm what she wanted to become, what you both wanted. I'm the bridge. The bridge usually gets burned, he said. Then we'll burn together, Eleanor replied. Behind them, the priestesses began to chant. The words were in languages that predated the modern world, but Eleanor understood them perfectly. They were singing wards, strengthening the Covenant bond, preparing Ravencairn for what was coming. Outside, in the Scottish night, Eleanor could feel the hunters drawing closer. The true war was about to begin. The hunters came on the 3rd night, and they came in force. Eleanor stood on Ravencairn's highest tower with Cassius, watching the darkness below fragment into movement. She could see them now, not individually, but as part of a living structure, a coven, larger than any Margot had documented in recent centuries. They wore the traditional armor of the Inquisition, though their weapons were modern crossbows, silver nets, stakes of blessed oak. At least 40, Cassius said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of tactical analysis. Maybe 50, more arriving every minute. Eleanor could feel them too, now that the binding had awakened her senses. She could taste their intent in the air, bitter as burnt copper. These weren't random hunters. These were organized, and they moved with the precision of an army that knew what it was fighting. How are they organized? Eleanor asked. I thought vampires were solitary, territorial creatures. Mostly, yes, Cassius said grimly. But the oldest covens have structures that predate democracy. The Illuminati, the Inquisition, the so-called Hunters Guild, they're all different manifestations of the same ancient order, an order dedicated to maintaining the balance. According to their philosophy, vampires are a necessary plague, kept in check through fear of exposure and annihilation. And the Covenant. He paused. The Covenant is an abomination, a hybrid bloodline that could upset the balance entirely. Because I'm not purely vampire or purely human. Because you're both, perfectly balanced, Cassius corrected. You can walk in daylight if you choose. You can feed on blood or sustenance. You can age, but you won't, not unless you decide to. You're everything they've been trying to prevent for 1,000 years, a being that breaks the rules that keep the supernatural hidden. The hunters began their assault at midnight. Eleanor had expected a siege, arrows and explosions, and the slow pressure of overwhelming numbers. Instead, the attack came through the Covenant chamber itself, through the blood wards that had supposedly made Ravencairn impregnable. One of the younger priestesses, a woman named Sophia, who couldn't have been more than 25, came running into the great hall where Eleanor and Cassius were preparing. They've found the source of the wards, Sophia gasped, blood streaming from her temple. Someone broke the main altar. The protective circle is collapsing. Cassius was moving before she finished speaking, pulling Eleanor with him. They raced through Ravencairn's corridors, and Eleanor felt it too, the weakening of the wards, like a dam cracking. The hunters were using some kind of ritual magic, something that predated the Covenant itself. The Covenant chamber was in chaos. 3 of the priestesses lay unmoving on the cold stone. The 5th, Margot, stood before the corrupted altar, her hands glowing with blood-red light as she fought to maintain the wards against pure entropy. At the chamber's entrance stood a figure Eleanor recognized from her blood memory, a man whose face she'd seen in visions of every dark moment the Covenant had endured. A man with eyes like crushed sapphires and a smile that held no humanity. Mordecai, Cassius breathed, and it was the first time Eleanor had heard true fear in his voice. But that's impossible. The priestesses destroyed you. I watched them do it. The necromancer laughed. Destroyed? My dear boy, they merely scattered me across dimensions. It took 300 years to reassemble myself, but the hunter's magic is strong, and they finally called me back. I am their fail-safe, the weapon against the Covenant. He raised his hand, and Eleanor felt reality fracture. It wasn't a physical attack. It was an assault on existence itself, on the fundamental laws that kept matter and spirit separate. Margot screamed, her bloodlight wavering. Eleanor moved without thinking. She stepped into the space between Margot and Mordecai, and she drew on the power that had been dormant in her blood since before her birth. The Covenant binding had activated something inside her, not just memory, but authority. the ability to command blood the way a conductor commands an orchestra. Her own blood rose from her palm in a spiral of crimson light, and she shaped it into a barrier. When Mordecai's entropy struck it, the blood didn't break. It didn't resist. It simply transformed, converting his weapon into something else, feeding it back to him as a reflection of his own power. Mordecai staggered back, genuinely surprised. "Interesting," he said, "but futile." Cassius seized the moment. He fell on the necromancer like vengeance incarnate, and Eleanor realized she had been naive about what Cassius truly was. The poetry, the guilt, the restraint, all of it was a careful facade he maintained. Beneath it lived 300 years of hunger and rage, and the absolute determination of a predator who had finally identified a threat to something he valued more than his own redemption. He fought like something that had been baptized in fury, but Mordecai was older, and he fought like someone who had already died and found the experience tedious. They clashed in the center of the chamber, two ancient creatures locked in a dance that predated human civilization. Eleanor felt Margot's hand grip her shoulder. "The altar," the priestess gasped. "You can use it. The binding has made you the focal point of the covenant. If you can reach the altar and speak the words, you might be able to seal the rift completely." Eleanor ran for the altar, stumbling over the corrupted remains of its previous guardians. Behind her, she heard Cassius scream a sound of agony that made her blood freeze. She nearly turned back, but Margot's voice drove her forward. The altar was inscribed with symbols that writhed when Eleanor looked at them directly. She pressed her bleeding palm against the stone and let her blood flow into the marks, let her newly awakened power fuel the ancient mechanisms. 3 bloodlines converge. Eleanor heard herself chanting in a language she'd never learned but somehow always known. 3 kingdoms made one. By blood and covenant, by love and sacrifice, by the price paid in flames, and the redemption bought in tears. Seal the rift. Bind the broken. Make us whole. The chamber exploded with light. When Eleanor's vision cleared, Mordecai was gone, scattered across dimensions once more, his assault disrupted. But Cassius lay on the stone floor, and there was something wrong with him. His left arm had been severed at the shoulder, and even as Eleanor watched, it didn't regenerate. The wound was seared, cauterized with whatever dark magic Mordecai had wielded. "Cassius!" Eleanor threw herself at his side. His eyes found hers, and even through the pain, she saw something like relief. "You did it. You actually—" "Don't talk," Eleanor ordered, her hands shaking. "Don't we can fix this. The priestesses can." "Eleanor," Cassius said quietly, gripping her good hand with his remaining one. "I think I've been looking for an ending for 300 years. Maybe this is it. Maybe this is finally the mercy I've been too stubborn to accept." "No." Eleanor's voice cracked. "No, I don't accept that. I didn't find you just to lose you. That's not how this ends." Behind them, Margot was already moving, pulling Eleanor away from Cassius. "The hunters are still coming," the priestess said urgently. "We have to move now, or we all die here." Eleanor looked at Cassius, and something in her, something born from the covenant binding, something that had Catherine's memory and her own will, made a decision. She bit her own wrist and pressed it to Cassius's lips. "Drink. Not from hunger, but from covenant. Drink your way back from the edge of oblivion. That's what the covenant means, right? That we save each other?" Cassius's eyes widened, but he didn't pull away. He drank, and as his blood merged with Eleanor's, the binding shifted into something new, something deeper than the original ritual. The severed wound began to close, not with new flesh, but with something stronger. Covenant light flowed through Cassius's veins, and he gasped as the transformation occurred. When he opened his eyes again, they burned with crimson fire. "What did you do?" he whispered. "I gave you a reason to live," Eleanor said. "A real one, not just guilt and penance. I made us bound, not just vampire and human, but covenant eternal. If one of us falls, the other pulls them back." Cassius pulled her close, and in that moment, Eleanor felt less like she was being held by a man, and more like she was being woven into something larger, a spell, a prophecy, a promise written in blood. Outside, the hunters were breaking through. The war was only beginning. The priestesses created a passage through Ravencairn's secret ways, tunnels carved from living stone that predated human habitation. Eleanor ran through darkness alongside Cassius, their hands linked, their blood still singing the resonance of the new covenant that bound them. Behind them, she could hear the hunters tearing through the manor, could feel their rage at discovering their prey had escaped. Margot led them to a chamber deep beneath the earth, one that Eleanor somehow recognized from her blood memory. A crypt that had witnessed 300 years of covenant rites. In its center stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal lay a book bound in leather that shimmered between solid and shadow. The Codex of Ascension, Margot said, breathing hard. The grimoire that documents every covenant binding since the original 7 priestesses made their covenant with the first transformed one. If you're to survive what comes, you need to understand what you've become. Eleanor took the book, and the moment her fingers touched its cover, she understood. This was her book, now written in her blood and Cassius's blood, a record of their becoming. Every page was blank except for the ones describing her and Cassius. And as she watched, new words appeared, documenting this very moment. "They'll follow us," Cassius said, his newly transformed eyes fixed on the tunnel entrance. "The hunters won't stop until they've eliminated the threat you represent." "Then we don't hide," Eleanor said, the certainty that came from the covenant binding absolute in her voice. "We go to them. We call a conclave." Margot stared at her. The conclave hasn't been called in 200 years. It would require consensus from all the major covens, vampire and hunter both. "Then we convince them," Eleanor said simply. "We show them that the covenant isn't a threat to the balance. We show them it's the only thing that can maintain the balance." They emerged from Ravencairn under a moonless sky, and Eleanor felt the weight of centuries settle on her shoulders. She was no longer just a woman with an impossible heritage. She was the living embodiment of a prophecy, the firstborn of a new age. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure. Cassius gathered 7 other vampires to their cause over the next 3 nights, ancient creatures who had grown weary of the endless war between their kind and the hunters. They came to Ravencairn despite the danger, drawn by the whispers of something new, something that promised an end to the endless cycle of blood and violence. The conclave was called in a neutral ground, an abandoned cathedral in Edinburgh, its stained glass windows covered over centuries of neglect, its altar stripped of all holy relics. Both vampire covens and hunter representatives arrived, each suspicious of the other, each certain that Eleanor's appearance was a sign of war rather than peace. The head hunter was a woman named Cassandra, and Eleanor recognized her immediately, not from her blood memory, but from something deeper, the covenant bond that now connected her to all beings touched by its magic. This woman had been a hunter for 200 years, had killed 17 vampires she considered threats, and had lost her lover to a vampire's hunger in the 17th century. "The creature stands before us," Cassandra said, her voice resonating through the cathedral. "Born of abomination, marked with the taint of both predator and prey, we should execute her immediately and prevent whatever catastrophe her existence portends." "I am not a creature," Eleanor said calmly, stepping forward. "I am Eleanor Ashford, and I carry the bloodline of both the Covenant priestesses and the first vampire ever cursed. I am not here to wage war. I'm here to end it." "You are a weapon," one of the elder vampire lords said, a creature named Thessalus, who had walked the earth for 4,000 years. "A living embodiment of power that upsets every law we have created." "Yes," Eleanor acknowledged, "but I'm a weapon of neither your side nor theirs. I belong to the Covenant itself, a kingdom that existed before the vampire curse, before the hunter's oath. If you'll listen, I can show you how to coexist without annihilating each other." She opened the codex, and as the assembled creatures, vampire lords and hunter generals looked at the pages, they saw themselves. The codex showed them their own histories, reflected back through the lens of the Covenant. It showed them the moment the first vampire was cursed, which was the same moment the first priestess swore to maintain the balance. It showed them how every war they'd fought had already been recorded, already been foreseen, already been written into prophecy. "You're showing us our own deaths," Thessalus whispered, touching the codex with something like reverence. "I'm showing you your own redemptions," Eleanor corrected. The Covenant was never meant to be a tool of war. It was meant to be a bridge. The vampire lords exist to remind humanity of the darkness inside ourselves. The hunters exist to remind the vampires that darkness alone cannot sustain life. And the Covenant bloodline exists to show both sides that they are necessary to each other. Cassandra stepped forward, and Eleanor saw the moment the hunter recognized something in her face, perhaps the ghost of Catherine, or perhaps the reflection of her own pain. "If I agree to this," Cassandra said quietly, "if I convince the other hunters to stand down, what happens to the ones I've killed? What happens to all the vampire murders done in the name of balance?" "They're already written in," Eleanor said, and she was surprised by the gentleness in her voice. "The Codex doesn't judge. It remembers. And as long as we remember, as long as we acknowledge the cost of the war we've been fighting, there's always the possibility of atonement. One by one, the assembled creatures approached the codex, some weeping, some with faces carved from ancient stone. Eleanor watched them read their own histories, their own futures, and she understood that she was witnessing the end of an age. By dawn, the conclave had reached consensus. The hunters would cease their pursuit of the Covenant bloodline. The vampire covens would agree to a new treaty, one that bound them not through fear, but through mutual understanding. And Eleanor, as the living embodiment of the bridge, would serve as mediator between worlds. It won't last forever, Cassius said quietly as they stood in the cathedral's rose window light. Humans forget. Vampires hunger. The balance will need constant tending. Then we'll tend it, Eleanor said. For as long as we live. She looked at Cassius, and she saw the man beneath the monster, beneath the saint, beneath the sinner. She saw 300 years of waiting crystallized into a single moment of perfect clarity. I love you, she said, and the words felt like incantation, like covenant, like the final seal on a promise older than human language. Cassius pulled her close, and in that moment, Eleanor understood that love wasn't the opposite of damnation. It was the only thing that made damnation bearable. The cathedral doors opened, and morning light flooded in. For the first time in 300 years, Cassius de Vere didn't flinch from the sun. Not everyone agreed with the conclave's decision. 3 days after the treaty was signed in blood and prayer, Eleanor received word that a faction of hunters had split from the main order. They called themselves the Purifiers, and their intent was absolute: destroy the Covenant bloodline before it could establish itself as law. Eleanor stood in Ravencairn's library, her library now, she supposed, inherited through bloodline and ritual, and read the intercepted message with something that felt like resignation. The prophecy had never promised peace, only balance. And balance required constant pressure from both sides. They're gathering in Prague, Margot said, pointing to a map of Central Europe. The old city has natural wards against Covenant magic. If they establish a stronghold there, they could mount a resistance that would take decades to overcome. Or, we could end this now. One of Cassius's allies suggested a vampire named Isidore who had lived through the Napoleonic Wars and had grown weary of running. Strike before they're prepared. Show them that the Covenant can defend itself. Eleanor felt Cassius watching her, waiting to see what the woman who had spoken such poetry about peace would do when faced with pragmatic violence. We go to Prague, Eleanor said, but not to fight, to talk. The journey took 3 days. Eleanor traveled with Cassius and 5 priestesses, moving through the European countryside under cover of darkness and Covenant magic. They arrived in Prague as the Danube rose beneath them, the city's red roofs and black spires emerging from mist like something from her blood memory. The Purifiers had established their base in an old monastery on the city's outskirts, a place where violence had already been committed in the name of holy righteousness. Eleanor could feel the weight of centuries of torture, of faith weaponized, of human cruelty blessed by divine authority. She walked alone into their stronghold. No weapons, no guards, just herself and the codex bound against her heart. The Purifier leader was a man named Thorn Young, barely 30, but carrying the eyes of someone who'd witnessed horrors that age couldn't touch. Eleanor recognized his type immediately. He was like Cassandra had been before the conclave, a person who had suffered so profoundly that love had calcified into purpose. You shouldn't have come here, Thorn said, and there was almost regret in his voice. I respect your courage, but you've walked into a trap. I know, Eleanor said calmly. But I came anyway because I need to show you something. She opened the codex. Unlike with the conclave, she didn't show Thorn his own history. Instead, she showed him what he was terrified of: the future, where the Covenant succeeded, where vampire and hunter coexisted, where people like him found no purpose in a world that no longer needed soldiers. Thorn's face crumpled. I don't know how to exist in a world where this war is over. This is all I am. If I stop being a hunter, I'm nothing. No, Eleanor said gently, and she was surprised by how much Catherine's compassion lived in her chest. If you stop being a hunter, you get to be something new, something that hasn't been defined by violence. Wouldn't that be worth exploring? Behind them, Cassius and the priestesses had arrived, but they made no move to attack. This wasn't a war. This was a conversion, and conversions could only work if the person choosing transformation agreed. Thorn looked at the codex, at Eleanor, at the choice crystallizing before him. If I stand down, he said slowly, if I order the Purifiers to disband, what happens to us? Do we just disappear? Do we serve the covenant, the way some of the priestesses do? You could, Eleanor said. Or you could create something new. A third organization, hunters who don't hunt, but who watch, who stand ready in case the balance tips, who ensure that both vampire and human remain in equilibrium. She closed the codex and looked directly into Thorne's eyes. You don't have to stop being what you are. You just have to expand your understanding of what that means. It took 3 hours of conversation, but eventually, Thorne agreed. He disbanded the purifiers, and instead of resisting the covenant, he helped Eleanor establish what would come to be known as the Vigil, a neutral order of humans and vampires dedicated to maintaining peace. When Eleanor and Cassius finally left Prague, it was not as fugitives, but as what they had become, ambassadors of a new age. 3 months after the conclave, Eleanor stood on the highest tower of Ravencairn and felt the weight of prophecy, like an old coat she'd been wearing so long, she'd forgotten it was there. The Covenant was stabilizing. The vampire covens had begun to integrate with the Vigil's oversight. Hunter factions were dispersing into this new framework, finding purpose in observation rather than annihilation. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Eleanor felt incomplete. The binding she and Cassius shared was deep, but it was imperfect, a temporary measure born from desperation and passion, rather than the true soul bonding that the ancient priestesses had performed. Every night, Eleanor could feel Cassius pulling away slightly, his 300-year-old consciousness trying to protect her from the full weight of what loving him meant. And every night, Eleanor felt him slip further beyond her reach. She discussed it with Margot in the library, among the stacks of leather-bound wisdom. The soul binding requires both participants to be willing to surrender everything, Margot explained, running her fingers along ancient texts. Not just their bodies or their memories, but their fundamental selves. It's the deepest magic the Covenant knows, deeper than turning, deeper than the initial binding, and it's irreversible. Would it hurt? Eleanor asked. Yes, Margot said simply. It would hurt more than birth and death combined. You would experience each other's existence so completely that there would be no separation between you. Sometimes, that's beautiful. Sometimes, it's torture. And sometimes it's both, Eleanor said, understanding. That night, she asked Cassius to meet her in the crypt beneath Ravencairn, the chamber where priestesses had kept vigil for centuries, where blood had been spilled and prayers had been answered. Cassius arrived carrying candles, and when he saw Eleanor standing before the altar in white linen, he understood. Eleanor. No, he said immediately. You don't know what you're asking. I know exactly what I'm asking, Eleanor interrupted, and I'm asking anyway. I want to be bound to you, Cassius, not because the prophecy demands it, not because the covenant requires it, because I choose it. Cassius's control fractured. You can't make that choice rationally. The soul binding is compulsion made sacred. Once it's done, you'll be drawn to me for all eternity. You won't be able to escape me, even if you wanted to. Good, Eleanor said. Because I want to spend eternity with you, and I don't want either of us to have the luxury of running away when it gets difficult. She took his hands and placed them on her heart. 300 years ago, you fell from grace for love. You were punished for it, made to watch Catherine burn, made to carry the weight of that failure across centuries. Let me give you something different. Let me give you absolution. Not from God, because I don't think either of us deserve that, but from me. Cassius's eyes burned with tears that vampires shouldn't be able to shed. Eleanor. The soul binding, Eleanor said. Now, before you convince me to be reasonable, they performed the ritual themselves, because the priestesses would have counseled caution. They cut their wrists and merged their blood in the ancient chalice. They spoke vows that had no witnesses but the stones and the candlelight. They opened themselves to each other with no barriers, no restraint, no possibility of refusal, and the pain began. Eleanor experienced 300 years of Cassius's existence compressed into a single moment. She felt his first kiss as a human, tasted Catherine's lips through his memory. She felt the moment of the curse, the burning transformation, the agony of becoming something new and unholy. She felt 3 centuries of hunger, not just for blood, but for redemption that never came, for forgiveness that seemed impossible. But underneath the pain, she felt something else. His love for her. Not the love he'd had for Catherine, though that was there too, woven through her bloodline like golden thread, but a love specific to her, Eleanor Ashford, mortal woman who had walked into his nightmare and chosen to stay. Eleanor, who had read his history and loved him anyway. Eleanor, who had not demanded he become something new, but had asked only that he live. And Cassius, in turn, experienced Eleanor's life. Her childhood, lonely and strange, haunted by dreams she couldn't explain. Her education, all those books and gothic novels that had been secret preparation for understanding him. Her mother's death, that unexplained complication that was really the Covenant blood calling to itself across generations. Her discovery of him in mirrors and dreams, and the absolute certainty that had settled into her bones the moment she saw his face. He experienced her transformation the way she had walked into Ravencairn as a human, and emerged as something new, something that bridged all the kingdoms. He felt her love for him grow not from passion alone, but from deep understanding, from seeing him at his absolute worst, and choosing to love him anyway. When the binding completed, they collapsed together, and Eleanor wasn't sure where her body ended, and Cassius's began. They were still two people, she could still feel the boundaries of herself, but now those boundaries were permeable. They could sense each other's emotions, understand each other's thoughts without words. In the moments after the binding, Eleanor felt Cassius's fear transform into something like peace. "I'm sorry," he thought to her, and she felt it like a vibration through her own blood. "No," Eleanor replied, without speaking. "Stop being sorry. Start being alive." They stayed in the crypt through the morning light, wrapped around each other, learning how to exist as two people who were also somehow one. It should have been claustrophobic. Instead, Eleanor felt more free than she ever had safe, in a way that had nothing to do with protection, and everything to do with being known. By the time they emerged into the library, the priestesses knew. Margot took one look at them and smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had predicted the inevitable. "The soul bonded," she said. "It's been 300 years since Ravencairn witnessed one. Welcome home, Eleanor. Welcome home, Cassius de Vere. Now your true work begins." Eleanor held Cassius's hand, and through their new bond, she felt his question. "What work?" he asked aloud. "Teaching others," Margot said simply. "There are other vampire-human pairs beginning to manifest. The Covenant is calling to itself, trying to establish the proper hierarchy, 7 bloodlines, as the prophecy foretold. You and Eleanor are the prototype. The pattern all the others will follow." Eleanor and Cassius exchanged a look that required no words. They had come to Ravencairn looking for safety, and found prophecy instead. They had found each other and discovered that love in the presence of absolute knowledge was something altogether more profound than romance. They had found home in the space between damnation and redemption, and the night was only just beginning. The second soul-bonded pair arrived at Ravencairn in early spring. Eleanor felt them coming before the priestesses sent word of vibration through the Covenant bonds that connected all of its children. 2 people, 1 vampire and 1 human, drawn together by the same inexorable pull that had brought her and Cassius together. Their names were Valerian and Isolde, and their story was markedly different from Eleanor and Cassius's, though the ending was the same, a recognition that transcended species and mortality. Over the next 6 months, 5 more pairs arrived. Some came willingly, having heard whispers of the Covenant reawakening. Others came as Eleanor had confused, haunted by dreams and reflections of lovers who didn't exist yet, driven by a longing they couldn't articulate. Each bonding was different. Some pairs found each other through blood memory, others through ancestral recognition. One woman, Evangeline, had been a vampire hunter for 40 years before discovering that her target, a 3,000-year-old vampire named Lysander, was the other half of her soul. Eleanor learned to preside over the bindings, learned to guide couples toward the altar, and the knife, and the irrevocable choice. She learned to recognize the moment when doubt should be honored, and when fear should be pushed through. She became, in essence, what Margot had been: a keeper of sacred mysteries, a guardian of transformation. But with each binding, Eleanor felt something shifting in the Covenant itself. The priestesses had spoken of the 7 pairs, born of the blood bonding, meant to establish a new hierarchy. But by autumn of that first year, Eleanor understood something the ancient texts hadn't explained clearly. The 7 weren't just 7 pairs. They were 7 types of bonding, 7 different ways that vampire and human could merge, 7 distinct paths through the Covenant. Eleanor and Cassius represented the fallen knight redemption through love, mercy granted by those who had every reason to refuse it. Valerian and Isolde represented the hunter's prey enemies bound by fate, learning to trust what they'd been taught to kill. Lysander and Evangeline represented the Shadow Watcher, the protector, and the protected, recognition across years of hidden devotion. And the others, arriving in 1s and 2s, represented the cursed bond, the rejected covenant, the Gothic discovery, and finally, the last arrival, a pairing that Eleanor didn't immediately recognize. His name was Thaddeus, and he was one of the purifiers who had stood down with Thorn. He arrived alone, without a bonded partner, and Eleanor could see the confusion and desperation in his eyes. "There's someone," Thaddeus said, finding Eleanor in the library. "I've been dreaming of her, the way the texts describe. But she's not vampire and she's not priestess. She's something else. And she's scared. I can feel her fear through whatever connection we share." Eleanor closed her eyes and extended her senses through the covenant bonds, searching. And yes, there. A whisper of something that wasn't quite human, wasn't quite vampire. Something caught between, something new. "What's her name?" Eleanor asked. "Seraphina," Thaddeus said. "And she doesn't know she's looking for me. She just knows she's looking for something that makes the emptiness stop." Eleanor took Thaddeus to the priestesses, and together, they performed the seeking ritual, a binding variant that allowed the covenant to locate Seraphina and guide her toward Ravencairn. She arrived 3 weeks later, carried on a tide of covenant magic that neither she nor anyone else could control. She was young, barely 20, and already carrying the marks of someone who had lived many lives. Her eyes held memory that wasn't hers, knowledge that had been encoded in her DNA before birth. When she saw Thaddeus, she began to cry. "I've been alone for so long," she whispered. "Even with people around me, I've been so alone. And I didn't know why, until I saw you." "The rejected covenant," Margot said quietly to Eleanor, as they watched Thaddeus and Seraphina embrace. The pairing born from desperation and sacrifice, the hunters who chose the covenant over their vows, claiming something new in exchange for everything they lost. It's the rarest binding only happens once in a century, if at all. By winter, all 7 pairs had found each other and undergone the soul binding. The covenant chambers of Ravencairn became a cathedral to new love and ancient prophecy. Eleanor moved through the halls with Cassius, watching the future crystallize around them. One night, standing in the library with all 6 other pairs, Eleanor felt the covenant shift into something larger. The priestesses, who had been watching and waiting for 300 years, finally stood down. The new order, the 7, they came to be called, took over the true maintenance of balance. It wasn't a hierarchy of power, but of responsibility. Eleanor and Cassius served as advisors, but the actual governance was distributed among the 7 pairs. Each brought their own perspective, their own understanding of the balance that had to be maintained. "This is how it was supposed to happen from the beginning," Eleanor said, looking around at her siblings in covenant. "No," Margot corrected gently. "This is how it was always supposed to happen. The priestesses just held the space open long enough for it to become possible." As winter deepened, Eleanor felt herself settling into a kind of peace she had never thought possible. Not the peace of resolution or happy ending, but something more profound, the peace of knowing her purpose, understanding her place in something larger than herself. She was no longer just Eleanor Ashford, mortal woman, with an impossible heritage. She was Eleanor DeVere, soul-bonded keeper of the covenant, architect of a new age, and she was only beginning. The attack came from a place Eleanor had not anticipated. One of the original covens, a collective of Russian vampires who had not attended the conclave, moved against Ravencairn in the dead of winter. They came with a weapon that the priestesses had hoped would never manifest. A necromancer more powerful than Mordecai, older than time, raised from a tomb that should have been sealed forever. His name had been Michael once, centuries ago. Now he was something else, a void given shape, entropy wrapped in the memory of humanity. The attack came on a night when 3 of the 7 were away, establishing new covenant sanctuaries. Eleanor stood on Ravencairn's battlements with Cassius, watching the darkness fragment into moving shapes, and felt something like acceptance settle into her bones. The prophecy had never promised that this would be simple. It had only promised that they could survive it. "We could run," Cassius offered, though she felt his refusal through their bond. "The covenant can survive without Ravencairn. We could re-establish." "No," Eleanor said. "This place has been sanctuary for 1,000 years. These stones have held priestesses and prophecies, and the weight of every sacrifice the covenant has demanded. If we abandon it, we abandon the whole structure." Mikhail arrived before midnight, and he came alone. This wasn't a siege. It was a challenge. Eleanor walked out to meet him, and Cassius moved to follow, but she placed a hand on his chest. "This is mine," she told him through their bond. "Let me do this." Michael was beautiful in the way that true evil was beautiful, perfect and terrible and utterly inhuman. His face was carved from something older than marble. His eyes held nothing that could be bargained with or understood. "Eleanor Ashford," he said, and his voice was like hearing the end of the world pronounced. The living embodiment of the covenant prophecy. I've come to correct a historical error. Then come, Eleanor said, and she meant it. The fight that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced before. Michael didn't attack her body. He attacked her existence, trying to unravel the threads that held her together at a fundamental level. It was magic that predated language, that operated at the boundary between being and non-being. Eleanor responded, with something she didn't know. She possessed the ability to bind entropy itself, to create structure from chaos, to be the opposite of what Michael represented. She drew on every memory in her blood, every sacrifice the covenant had made, every prayer that had been offered on these ancient stones. She drew on Cassius's love, his 300-year wait, his willingness to damn himself for the possibility of her existence. And slowly, inch by inch, she began to win. But the cost was visible in her own body. Her mortal form, which had been immune to aging, began to show the toll. Her hair went silver, not from years but from the effort of channeling forces that predated human understanding. Her hands became translucent, as though she was fading. Eleanor, stop. Cassius's thoughts crashed through their bond like thunder. Let me... No, she responded. If I stop, he wins. And if he wins, the covenant falls. Everything we've built, everything the priestesses died, protecting it all collapses. Michael laughed. You can feel yourself dying. The covenant blood was never meant to survive this kind of assault. You're unraveling, little priestess, and in a moment, you'll... Eleanor moved. With the last of her strength, she drove herself directly into Mikhail's center, and she opened the soul bond between herself and the necromancer, something that should have been impossible, something that violated every sacred law the covenant maintained. If she could be bonded to Cassius, if she could be united with her vampire lover in a way that transcended species and mortality, then perhaps, just perhaps, she could show Mikhail what he had been missing all along, what it meant to be connected to something, rather than to stand apart from everything in eternal isolation. The necromancer screamed. It wasn't a sound of pain, but of understanding. For the first time in 10,000 years, Mikhail experienced connection. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The memory that he had once been something other than destruction, something other than entropy. And in that moment of weakness, Eleanor seized the opportunity. She didn't destroy him. Instead, she showed him the covenant, showed him that there was a place even for creatures like him, monsters that the world had rejected, showed him that redemption wasn't about becoming something new, but about being seen for what you already were. Mikhail collapsed, and when he looked up at Eleanor, his eyes held something approaching humanity. I could join you, he said quietly. I could become part of this covenant. Yes, Eleanor said, her mortal form barely holding together. But the price is that you must live with what you've done, that you must carry the weight of 10,000 years of destruction, and choose every day not to repeat it. That sounds like hell, Mikhail said. It is, Eleanor agreed, but it's a hell you'll survive. Eleanor collapsed in Cassius's arms as midnight passed. She was dying not from Mikhail's attack, but from the effort of binding him, of showing him mercy, of trying to save something that had been lost so long that redemption seemed impossible. No, Cassius said, and there was absolute refusal in his voice. I didn't find you just to lose you now. I didn't spend 300 years waiting. I know, Eleanor whispered. But some debts have to be paid in full. The covenant demanded a sacrifice, and, then the covenant is wrong, Cassius said flatly. He made the choice that no soul-bonded vampire was supposed to make. He severed the bond between them not completely, but enough to separate their existences. And in doing so, he took the death wound meant for Eleanor and claimed it as his own. Eleanor felt him beginning to fade. No, she screamed, and she did something no covenant priestess had ever done before. She inverted the ritual that Margot had taught her, the binding ceremony that she and Cassius had undergone. Instead of merging their souls, she separated them, and in that separation, she grafted her immortality onto his dying form. Cassius gasped back to life, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in her own existence. She was still Eleanor, still soul-bonded to Cassius. But her mortality, the human part of her that had made the covenant pairing special, transferred fully to him, which meant that Cassius, the vampire, was now mortal. And Eleanor, the human, was now something else entirely. What did you do? Cassius asked, horror and wonder mixing in his voice. I made us equal, Eleanor said simply. I made the balance true. You've spent 300 years as a creature of darkness looking for light. Now you get to live as a creature of light for whatever time remains to you. That's the gift of being mortal. Cassius, knowing that the time matters. She stood and felt her new form settling into something unprecedented. Not vampire, not human, but a synthesis of both. A true embodiment of the bridge that the Covenant had always meant to be. The other 6 pairs arrived as dawn broke, and they found Eleanor standing before Michal, who knelt in oath to the Covenant. They found Cassius, struggling with the strange new sensation of mortality, of time that would eventually end. And they understood that the prophecy had finally been fulfilled, not as they had imagined, but in the way that prophecies usually worked. Not as expected, but as necessary. Eleanor had become what the Covenant had always meant to create. A being that belonged wholly to neither kingdom, but served both. 5 years passed. Ravencairn transformed from a secret sanctuary into something larger, a university of the arcane arts, where vampires and humans could study together, where the old lies about monsters and victims could finally be examined and discarded. The Covenant moved from myth into reality, becoming something that governments begrudgingly acknowledged. Hunters and vampires joined through a shared understanding that coexistence required constant work. Eleanor moved through Ravencairn's hallways as something between priestess and legend. She had aged not in years, but in bearing. The weight of prophecy had settled into her bones, and she carried it with a grace that came from understanding that every sacrifice had been necessary. Every loss had bought something irreplaceable. Cassius had aged in a more conventional way. The mortality that Eleanor had given him was real and ongoing, stripping away his immortal invulnerability with each passing season. He had gray in his hair now, lines around his eyes, and Eleanor found herself treasuring these marks of human limitation in a way that seemed impossible for someone who had spent 300 years trying to escape them. One evening, they stood together in the library where they had first kissed, and Eleanor felt the question thrumming through their bond before Cassius spoke it aloud. "Are you regretting it?" he asked quietly. "The sacrifice you made? You gave up mortality for me, gave up the one thing that made the Covenant balance true. That burden must be impossible," Eleanor finished. "Yes, it is impossible. And I would make the exact same choice 1,000 times over." She took his hand, his mortal hand, growing older, growing closer to the grave with each heartbeat, and placed it over her heart. "Do you feel that?" "I do. Every second of every day. You beating, staying alive, choosing to live as a creature with finite time instead of infinite hunger. That choice matters more to me than any immortality ever could." Cassius pulled her close, and Eleanor felt the familiar ache of their bond, the way love and sorrow were woven so tightly together that they couldn't be separated. "The priestesses are talking about retiring," Cassius said. "They want to step back completely, let the 7 take over entirely. Margot especially, she says she's ready to rest." "Then let her rest," Eleanor said. "The Covenant won't fall apart. We've built it strong enough to survive without the original architects. But not without us," Cassius said. It wasn't a question. "No," Eleanor agreed. "Not without us. Not yet." They spent the next hours walking Ravencairn's gardens, the spaces Eleanor had only known through dreams before meeting Cassius. The moonlit gardens where he had watched her sleep for months before ever revealing himself. The stone benches where priestesses had made vows that echoed across centuries. The Blood Moon Garden where the rarest Covenant ceremonies were performed, under the auspices of a darkness that was both sacred and profane. "I've been thinking about what comes next," Cassius said as they walked beneath ancient oaks. "Not for the Covenant, I trust the 7 with that, but for us, for me, specifically." Eleanor felt the weight of what he wasn't saying. "Your mortality. I don't have many years left," Cassius said quietly. 50, maybe 60 if I'm fortunate. The human body ages in ways that my vampire one never did. I'm beginning to feel it, the weariness, the way pain settles into joints and refuses to leave. They came to a halt beneath the oldest oak in the garden, one that had roots older than the manor itself. "I want to know what comes after death," Cassius continued. "I spent 300 years as a vampire wondering if there was redemption, if there was a way to balance the scales. And then I found you, and I found the answer wasn't redemption at all, it was connection. It was meaning. It was love that didn't care about the weight of the past, only the possibility of the future." Eleanor understood where this was going. Through their bond, she felt his fear and his acceptance intertwined. "You want to be reborn," she said softly. "You want the full Covenant transformation. Not as a vampire," Cassius said. "Not in the way I was before, but transformed. Yes. I've seen what happens to the soul bonded when one of the pair dies. I watched the priestesses mourn partners across centuries. I don't want to leave you that kind of pain, but I also don't want to become immortal again. Eleanor felt tears on her face. Then we'll find another way. The Covenant knows how to transform people into something new. We could make me something that lives as long as you do, but experiences time the way humans do, Cassius finished. A creature that's young again, but mortal in a new way, something between what I was and what you are. Eleanor kissed him, tasting the salt of her own tears on his lips. That's going to hurt. More than the first turning, more than the soul bonding. You'll experience decades of transformation compressed into moments. I know, Cassius said. But you'll be with me. And that makes all the difference. The ceremony happened on a moonless night, in the Covenant chamber where Eleanor had first bound herself to Cassius. The 6 other pairs attended, witnesses to a transformation that wasn't quite precedent but also wasn't entirely unprecedented. They sang the old words in languages that predated human nations, and Eleanor poured every ounce of her Covenant authority into the ritual, forcing the universe to acknowledge what she was asking of it. Transform him. Age him backward to the moment of his mortal death, but let him live onward from there, experiencing the fullness of time without the burden of eternal immortality. The transformation was agonizing to watch. Cassius's body struggled to accommodate the new reality being imposed upon it, struggled to accept aging in reverse while maintaining the knowledge of 300 years. But Eleanor held him through it, and when it was over, he emerged new and old all at once. His hair darkened back to black. The lines in his face softened, but his eyes remained ancient. He was young again, perhaps 30, the age he'd been when he first became a vampire. But the consciousness behind those eyes was still Cassius de Vere, 300-year-old cardinal turned vampire turned human turned something entirely new. How do you feel? Eleanor asked. Cassius stood shakily, testing his new body. Like I've been given a second life. But with the memory of how to make the first one matter. He reached for Eleanor, and she met him halfway across the chamber. When they kissed, she tasted the strange mixture of new flesh and ancient soul, of mortality renewed and love that had aged into something unshakable. The priestesses watched from the shadows, and Eleanor saw tears on even the hardest of their faces. They had spent 1,000 years maintaining the balance, and now they were watching the balance transform into something they had never imagined possible. In the months after Cassius's transformation, Eleanor began to understand something that the Codex had never quite captured, that the Covenant wasn't really about prophecy or balance or the endless war between vampire and human. It was about love, real love, the kind that required sacrifice and surrender, and the absolute willingness to see the other person clearly. The kind that didn't promise safety or even happiness, just meaning. The kind that understood that immortality without mortality was just echoes, and that mortality without connection was just counting down to silence. Eleanor de Vere, neither fully human nor fully vampire, but bridge between all the kingdoms, understood that she had been waiting her entire life for the moment when she could finally stop being a vessel for prophecy and just be Eleanor. And she had found that moment in the arms of a man who had spent 300 years running from his own redemption, only to discover that redemption wasn't something to be earned, it was something to be lived, day by day, choice by choice, love by love. As autumn arrived, and Ravencairn's gardens turned to gold and crimson, Eleanor stood on the highest tower with Cassius, and felt something like contentment settle into her bones. It wasn't the happiness promised in fairy tales. It was something harder, deeper, and infinitely more precious. The knowledge that they had both chosen this. They had chosen each other, despite the impossibility of the choice. They had chosen love in the face of all evidence that such a thing was fragile and temporary, and ultimately insufficient. And in choosing it, they had transformed not just themselves, but the entire world around them. The prophecy had been fulfilled, not as written, but as lived, and that, Eleanor understood, as she held Cassius close beneath the autumn stars, was always how prophecy was supposed to end, not with revelation, but with revolution, not with ending, but with transformation, not with destiny, but with choice.